Hello. This week we're going to be talking about administrating the resources of the congregation. Now, when we're talking about the resources of the congregation, we're basically talking about three things. Administrating the people, those people who work at the church, whether they are full-time, paid staff, or volunteer. They are still your primary resource of the church. The second resource of the church is the money. The administration of the money is of utmost importance. And then finally, the administration of the properties. So let's just kind of run through these for a few moments and be sure that you read thoroughly the readings in your textbook. But I just want to offer a few observations. First, managing the people. In my 37 years of pastoral ministry, I always understood that before I was a boss or before I was a CEO, that I was a pastor. And therefore, my administration of the people, guiding the people in the mission of the church, I always understood my primary role to be that of their pastor. That means that I had to be more patient. That means that I had to keep in mind not only that the people did their job well, but I had to take care of the people well. The struggle that many church leaders have is that when you're working with church people, most of the church folks are volunteers. And they should be highly praised because they've got full-time jobs, they've got kids to raise, kids to take to ball games, but they're taking a few hours of their week dedicated to serve in volunteer work at the church. They are the single most important resource you have. You need to make sure that they don't get burnt out. You need to make sure you're not overloading them. You need to make sure you're affirming them. You need to make sure you're giving them what they need to do their job right. If you have someone who's teaching Sunday school classes and they come to you and suggest they need a new audiovisual equipment or something to help them better do their job, it is your job as the leader of that church to see to it that your volunteers, that your paid staff are affirmed and are well supplied to be able to meet their obligations. The other thing that I would suggest, and just so you will know, most of the churches I pastored, I had one or two paid employees. In one church, we had a daycare. I had 19 paid employees. So I do have some experience in talking about this. It's important that they see you. It's important that you, what I call management by walking around, and that I was not just the boss, or not just the pastor, but that I had relationships with them, developing relationships with the people we serve. So administrating the people as resources, vitally important. One of the things that I always found helped me was to have clear job descriptions, and that's part of your responsibility in your final project, is understanding what job descriptions are. This is true whether it's paid staff or volunteer staff. You need to have job descriptions with specific responsibilities. Who do they account to? Who do they report to? What are their responsibilities? These job descriptions are very, very helpful in helping you evaluate them, but also it's helpful to them. They understand what their responsibility is. Another thing that is a must in every church, criminal background checks. If you're dealing with people, with children, if you're dealing with children in particular, every person on your staff should have a criminal background check. I went to pastor one church. We had about 30 volunteers and not one criminal background check in the bunch. So I called a meeting, got everybody to agree to do it. We got criminal background checks on everybody, and it is kind of funny when you're reading through them. In the last church, I had a few very fine men in their youth who had been arrested for marijuana violations and things like that, but nothing serious that would prohibit them from working in the church. But the criminal background checks are a necessity. In fact, some insurance companies are going to require criminal background checks. and those things have to be kept confidential, so you need to be able to handle those records carefully. But again, administering the people of the church, the most vital resource you have are those volunteers. And if you fail to use those volunteers correctly, to train those volunteers correctly, to care for those volunteers correctly, you're going to find that administrating those resources are going to be very difficult. You cannot be a temperamental person. You cannot take your frustrations out on the volunteers or even on your paid staff. Now, I will admit that when your staff is being paid, you have a little bit more authority over them. You're paying them good money, hopefully, good money to be able to do what they're asked to do, and therefore there's a much higher level of accountability there. But you never stop being the pastor of the church. Second thing I want to mention is administrating the finances of the church. Most people don't have a lot of extra money. They're giving you tithes and offerings. They're paying the tithe and offering to you or to your church. That money needs to be respected. That money needs to be respected. The administration of that money is probably the single most important administrative function that you will do. Because if they ever determine that you don't have integrity in dealing with the finances, you lose integrity across the board. They will get upset about mismanagement of funds. A church will get upset about mismanagement of funds before they get upset about anything else. My experience has been that once the church understands that you have integrity and they can trust you, they'll be very forgiving if you make some honest mistakes or if you trip up here and there. But if they ever find out, if they ever think that you have no integrity with the funds, then your ministry is going to be in trouble. The thing about this is the people you have. Who receives the money? How is the money processed? How is the money deposited? How is the money disbursed? How are the finances reported? Everyone in that chain needs to be people of highest integrity. I would suggest a couple of things. Number one, as the pastor or church leader, you and your spouse need to stay as far away from the actual handling of the funds as possible. You need to have people that you can count on that will take care of it, but you don't need to have your hands on that money because that opens up accusations of wrongdoing. The people that you have responsible for collecting the money, for counting the money, processing the deposit, making sure the money gets to the bank, the people that you have responsible for writing the checks, dispersing the funds, and giving reports, all of those people need to be highly competent individuals. You don't need to have someone serving as a church treasurer who cannot even balance their own checkbook. If you've got financial people in the congregation, those are the people that you tag. If you've got store managers, restaurant managers that are handling money and reporting these and processing monies, these are the people that you tag for the job. The other thing I would suggest is you don't ever, at no time does anyone collect money, process money, deposit money alone. Everything should be done in pairs. There should always be accountability at least 2 deep. So when you have ushers that are collecting the money, the ushers should always do it as a group. The people who are counting the money, recording the deposits, it should be done in a group. When someone goes to make a deposit, they should go in pairs. And all of that should have double accountability. You need to make sure that there are no questions in the administration of the funds. The other thing I want to point out that's vitally important in administration of money is accurate reports. Now, according to the minutes of the Church of God General Assembly, every pastor is supposed to give an adequate financial report to the church at least on an annual basis. Various churches have different responsibilities and different guidelines. But in the minutes of the General Assembly of the Church of God, there has to be an annual financial report. I want to make a couple of comments here. If your church is incorporated, and this depends upon the state in which your church is, but most states require incorporated businesses and nonprofits to make financial reports public. In other words, if you're an incorporated church, I know in the state of Georgia, if someone walks in off the street and makes a demand to see your financial report, there's an obligation that that financial report be made public. There are some rights that you have there, so if there ever becomes a question, then you need to make sure you talk to an attorney or an accountant. But the more public we make our financial reports, in my mind, the more sunlight, the better off we are. I always did annual reports as a pastor. Always had a annual conference where the primary purpose of the conference was to look over the receipts and the expenditures, and that becomes vitally important. How we report, how we hold accountability becomes vitally important in maintaining our integrity. And then there is the management of the property. What is the property being used for? Who can get married in the sanctuary? Who can use the fellowship hall? What's off limits? Like tables and chairs? Can everybody borrow tables and chairs in the church, or should that be restricted? I'm going to suggest that whatever policies that you have here, everything about the use of the property needs to be carefully thought out and needs to be written in a written policy. I've got policies on weddings, on how caterers are to treat the property when they come to cater a wedding rehearsal or a wedding dinner. Certain things cannot go on, like according to the minutes of the General Assembly. A homosexual wedding cannot, under any circumstances, be performed on church property held indeed by the Church of God. Interesting story here. A few years ago, right after the Obergefell decision, where the United States Supreme Court legalized homosexual marriages, it had been our policy to allow the state of Georgia Department of Family Children Services to have their annual regional training conferences on our church. We would supply, they could have the fellowship hall, parking lot, we would supply it for 2 or 3 days at our church, and they had workers from all over that part of the region of the state, typically 100, 120 folks come. And we've been doing that for several years. It was what we considered part of our ministry to the community. Well, after Obergefell, I got the phone call from the director of DFACS for our region, and she was wanting to schedule the facility again. And so I began to talk to her, and I said, look, I want you to hear me, and I did it in a very gentle tone. I said, I'm as sorry as I can be. But with the recent decision by the Supreme Court that legalized homosexual marriage, we have been advised by our attorney, and we have been advised by our attorney that we cannot allow any government agency to use our facilities any longer. To do so opens us up to the possibility of being required to sanction homosexual marriages or homosexual activities on our property. The response was remarkable. She said, Pastor, I totally understand. I have people working in my office who don't know how to go forward in this regard. What she was telling me was there were Christians in her office working for the state that were very uncomfortable with the way the federal and state government was moving in response to acknowledging homosexual unions. But these are the kinds of things that you've got to be thinking about. Another example is I was pastoring a church, and right down the block was the local Episcopal church, and we had a good relationship. The pastor and I met for coffee about once a week. And one day over coffee, the pastor was saying, we're having our annual Harvest Festival and we don't have any parking. We don't have enough parking. Could we possibly use your parking space? Sure. But there has to be more than a verbal agreement there. What are your liabilities? If you allow someone else to use your parking space for another event, there's an accident related to that event on your property. Where are your responsibilities? What are your liabilities? Those are the kinds of things. That's why you need to have everything about your management of your property. It needs to be a policy. It needs to be something that everyone understands. Something as simple as key policies. Who has keys to the door? I remember I went to one church, and shortly after being there, this was a large church and it had many exits and entrances. I mean, there were probably a dozen exits and entrances all around the various property. we began to have issues with people walking in off the street, sometimes just to use the bathroom, but they would be walking through the building during Sunday school. And so we met and we decided that all the entrances and exits would be open until 10 o'clock in the morning on Sunday. At 10 o'clock when we began Sunday school, all exits and entrances would be locked except the two primary. And there at the two primary doors, we would have two ushers. That way we could observe everyone who was going and coming. Those are the kinds of things you need to be thinking about. Who has access to your property? Who has access to your property when you're having service? Is anyone watching? Is anyone observing? Do you have people moving around to make sure everything's being properly taken care of? Who has access to your property when there's not a service going on or where something's not scheduled? All of those kinds of things are helpful. I'll tell you a funny story. I've already told you that one of the churches that I pastored, we had a daycare. Well, and when we started the daycare, one of the things we did was place cameras all around the property. We placed cameras in all the hallways near the bathroom exits. We placed cameras outside. Well, in the city that I was pastoring, there was a time when there was a rash of church burglaries, and I got a phone call from the sheriff one afternoon and said, "Pastor, we think your church is next. Can we set up a stakeout in your church?" And I said, "Sure, what do you need?" So I came by about 10 o'clock that night, let the deputies in, 3 or 4 deputies just went in the sanctuary, and they were just going to spend the night there. Well, sure enough, that night, the gang that was breaking in churches broke into our church. Everything was on film. Everything was filmed digitally. We had the break-in, we had the handcuffing, we had the chases that were going on inside the church. That helped us in the prosecuting of the people that were breaking and entering. It helped us in all kind of liabilities. Let me give you another example of what I'm talking about, kind of liabilities, because if you have a large children's program, you may want to think about placing cameras in certain places. We had an incident where a parent claimed a child was biting, and so we said, well, we can reconcile this real quickly. So we pulled the camera on the computer, we got the digital, and what we found out is that the child was biting himself. It was very plain. When the child would get mad, when a teacher would tell him to do something, the way he responded was just in anger. He'd just reach up and bite himself on the forearm. And we had that on film. So when we were able to demonstrate that we were not responsible, that it was something the child had done to himself, then we were relieved from liability. So these are the kind of things you need to be talking about. Now, the last thing I want to point out is in the administration of people, the administration of the money, and the administration of the property. A wise pastor has leaders. A wise pastor, church leader, cannot micromanage everything. So you put talented, responsible people in place. You have talented, responsible people managers to help you manage the volunteers and the paid staff. You have talented, responsible people when it comes to dealing with the money, and you have talented, responsible people when it comes to managing the properties. In the Church of God, the properties are held by the trustees for the benefit of the Church of God. Those trustees, and only those trustees, can sign documents to sell or buy real property, real estate for the church. But the primary oversight in the Church of God for the property, in fact, the primary lay oversight is the Church and Pastors Council. According to the minutes of the General Assembly, if a church decides to have a Church and Pastors Council, the Church and Pastors Council can be made of any male or female members over 16 years old, and they assist the pastor in the administration of the church in areas of spiritual, financial, and physical responsibilities. So I'm going to suggest here that whether you're an independent church, that you have a good deacon board, a good board of trustees, or whether it's something like a Church and Pastors Council, that you need to make sure that you're allowing these people to have a voice in the administration. They They have a voice, and when they have a voice, they take responsibility, and when they take responsibility, there is accountability. No pastor should be responsible to administrate all of these things alone. No pastor can adequately do it. Your responsibility as a pastor, your primary responsibility, is to shepherd the people and to teach and preach the Word of God and be a person of prayer. You need to be developing leaders. The purpose of apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers is to equip believers. Your job as pastor is to find leaders and train leaders. I suggest start with teenagers. Teenagers can receive offerings. Older teenagers can help count money. Teenagers can help in parking. Start with teenagers. Why start with teenagers? Because when you're starting with teenagers, you're building long-term leadership for the church. And my experience has been the more active and responsible you give, more activity and responsibility you give teenagers, the more likely it is they're going to stay in the church in their 20s and 30s. But you need to be very, very certain that you are developing and equipping leaders in the church to help you in the administration of people, money, and the properties. Now finally, in the reading assignments, you'll see I've got a couple of reading and viewing assignments. You'll see I've got a couple of videos from David Cooper at Mount Perrin Church of God in Atlanta. I suggest that you watch those, take the time to watch those. Another video that I have produced, and there are some documents there that are provided by the Church of God Benefits Board. The most important thing when it comes to administration, when it comes to money and things, written policies and records. And pastors are not omniscient. We don't know everything, but we're responsible for everything when it comes to the administration of the church. And so we need to find those resources that keep us apprised as to what's going on. Church of God Benefits Board for the Church of God does this in all sorts of areas. So I would, it's very important that you take some time this week and look through those manuals that the Church of God Benefits Board provides free of charge to every church and pastor. I would suggest that probably 90% of the questions that you have about many of these administrative issues, the answers can be found in the policy manuals provided by the Church of God Benefits Board. And the last thing I want to say, regardless of what church you're a part of, you're an independent church, you've got bylaws, you're a denominational church, you've got a minutes or you've got a book of discipline, make sure that everything you do, you're correctly following your book of discipline, your minutes, or your bylaws. Because most courts, in a situation where you're coming to court, as long as you're following your own ecclesiastical bylaws, the courts will determine that it's not their purview. But when you break your own ecclesiastical bylaws, when you fail to follow them, then you find yourself in legal liability. I've said this last thing many times, but I'm going to say it one more time. Every pastor needs three great friends: a good attorney, a good banker or accountant, and your denominational office. Those three situations, those three people, those three authorities, they will help you when you need to know something, when you need to ask questions, when you find yourself in a cloudy area. So maintain good contact and good relationships. God bless you.